Welcome to chapter 1, everybody, of Making Deer Donkey. Now, I am filming in the middle of a thunderstorm here, so if you hear some thunder and carry on, that's what's happening. We're making the body in this chapter, and we are starting with the rear legs. Now you can see I've got one beautiful little rear leg made up. Remember I told you that I'm using that contrasting colour on the foot pad. This is going to be all airbrushed, of course, to give it a slightly aged look. So starting with our leg pieces, you've got one with the joint spot and one without. We are going to put right sides together. Now, if you are not using mohair, you will not need to do this step, which I'm doing, which is I am taking a needle and I'm tucking in my fur before I start my pinning. With sparse mohair, it's much easier because it's not really dense fur that you're trying to tuck in here. So I've got my right sides together, obviously, and when I'm working on arms and legs, I intentionally work on the outer part of the limb when I do my pinning, my overcasting and my sewing, because generally it just gives you a leg that is just nicely tucked in and turned in, and you do the same with the other one and then it's mirrored. All those little things make a huge difference. So I've got my opening marked at the lower part of the leg, and these are my two marks for that opening. So I'm just going to pin all the way around. I'm going to leave this foot section open for the foot pad and this section open for turning, but I will get it pinned all the way around, and then I will overcast it with my extra strong thread. Now you absolutely need to overcast. This is what makes the difference in a perfect finish. So if you skip this step, you're just not going to get that perfect finish that we're after in a high-end collectible, which is definitely what we're making here. So I'm going to get that one pinned, overcast, and once I've done that, I'm going to take it to the machine. I am using 100% polyester thread in my machine. I use Gutermann, matched the colour to my backing fabric, not the fur. And in fact, I've gone a little bit darker, which I said earlier gives you a better result if you're making this vintage style. So I will be sewing a 4mm seam allowance from the base of the heel to this first mark. Make sure you back and forth here to reinforce the start of that opening. Then I will sew straight over the top of that the second time. My stitch length is set to a number 2, so it's nice and small. And once I've done that, I'll do the same here, starting back and forth all the way around down to the toe, 4mm seam allowance, and I will sew that 2 times. So there you can see that leg all stitched up, leaving that opening and the foot opening. I have gone ahead and just snipped the overcasting stitches just a little way from the edge of the base and the toe and the heel. That's so that I can open those seams out and just finger press them flat. So putting in the foot pad is much easier and you'll get it more accurate, because we need to take a pin straight through the centre of those. Now, before we're going to go any further, I forgot to tell you this because I'm using mohair. Because I'm using mohair, of course, I have used PVA mixture on that opening so it won't fray away. If you are using fabric, you will need to, before you put this piece together, to sew a nice close zigzag on each of those opening pieces, and that will stop it stretching and it stop it fraying away. Makes it much easier for when we go to stuff it and close that opening later. You need to do that on the back opening as well when we get to the body. So for now, we are going to add this foot pad. So I'm just going to, as I said, I've pressed that seam nice and flat. I've got my foot pad. The wider part across the top is the toe, and I'm going to take my pin at the 4mm seam allowance straight through that mark, and then at the 4mm seam allowance again and straight through that seam. Push that pin head all the way down. Then we're going to do the same with the heel. taking that pin through, and again, here comes the rain. There we go, and now I'm just going to fit in that foot pad all the way around. You'll find it will be a perfect fit if you have followed your seam allowance well. Tucking that fur in, take my pin through all of the layers, flip it over, take up just a little bit on the other side, push the pin head all the way down. Switch to the other side so that you're pinning it in nice and evenly. Make sure that pin is firmly anchored in that centre point. Tucking in that fur. And pinning through all the layers, flip it over, take up a little bit on the other side. I'm going to do the same all the way around till I've got that foot pad pinned in. I'm then going to overcast it, and then we're going to come back and we are going to back stitch that in place. Okay, so here we are, and I've got that stab back stitch started. So I've got a single strand of extra strong thread with a knot in the end, and I have started here. When I start, I always start with 2 stitches right on top of each other. And then I make my way from there. So I've gone around that toe section. I'm going to show you on this straighter edge. It's a bit easier to see. So my thread is coming from the underneath, and I'm just going to take my needle and bring my needle up, making the next stitch. Keep your stitches nice and small so that you can keep control of that line, and then you go back into the last exit hole, making sure that you're really pulling on that thread each time so it's nice and tight. Take that needle up again, just the length of 1 stitch. Do make sure you keep your stitches even. And you should be able to create a really beautiful line. This stitch, it's called the stab back stitch, and it is the stitch that we use when we're hand sewing soft sculpture. It's the strongest stitch of all because we're using the extra strong thread, and also because the stitch is linked back and front, so you only have to sew it once. It's not like sewing on the machine when I get you to sew those seams 2 times. So it really is just about being meticulous, and you'll find that you'll be able to get an absolutely beautiful line that's every bit as good as sewing on the machine. So when I get to the top section here, either side of each of those seams, I always do 2 stitches like I started with, and at the bottom as well. So here we have that leg, the little leg turned through. I've already made the hole for the joint with my awl before I turned it through, and I've really pushed out all of those seams, and I've taken the time to take my wire brush and brushing all of the fur out of those seams. Of course, if you're working with fabric, you don't have to worry about that. But it's really, really important because, and even when you're competing with teddy bear making, this is what the judges look for. They will check every seam to make sure that there's no fur caught. I even take my awl like this and pull all of that out. So now we're going to be ready to add the joint. And the shape we're looking at, we're going to be filling this leg, and you need to be thinking of the shape and which leg it is. You're not just filling a hole when you're stuffing, you're creating a shape. You need to keep the bottom of the foot quite flat as you can when you're stuffing. Be mindful of that. So supporting the end while you're stuffing it. If you just randomly stuff that leg, you're going to get a really bulbous end to the foot. We don't want that. We want it nice and flat and rounded. So it's important, like I said, to be thinking of that shape. You need to pack it super, super firm. And we're going to be popping that joint in first so that we can do that. So let's get our, remember to be stuffing, keeping that shape right and filling nice and evenly. Remember to keep a nice eclipse shape for the leg, quite flattened shape, certainly not just a rounded sort of a sausage. So those are all things to think about. Stuffing is an art form in itself, it really is. Take the time to get it right. So now we're going to add that joint. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got that hole properly enlarged, ready to take my joint disc. We've got a little bit of clear craft glue here. Just take those other pieces off of my joint, pop those aside, and then I'm going to just be adding just a little bit of clear craft glue. Of course, your bolt is glued to your disc. I've seen some people and they've been saying, why won't my joints tighten? You need to go back and watch my pay it forward videos on jointing. Your bolts all need to be glued to your base disc. And then when you go to do it up on the other side, because it's glued in, you're going to be able to tighten that really well. So what we're going to do is just take some clear craft glue and we're just going to pop some on the other side. Just a little bit, not too much, so that that's going to glue and it's going to hold. So now just carefully take that through the opening. You want to pass that through, find that hole for that bolt to pass through. Push that fabric nice and tight all the way down around that bolt, make sure it's nice and smooth. And once you've done that, you can, especially with mohair, I always move all the fur out the way as well. I brush it outwards, especially with longer fur, because you want that fur to be poking out, you don't want it caught up. So now add the other pieces to your joint, just because it's easier to have them out of the way, and it clamps down on that glue, and it means you can go ahead and you can stuff that leg with that glue still drying. So there we go. Now we're ready to actually fill that little leg. I'm going to do that using my forceps, and I'm going to start with the foot, of course, take that right down to the toe, and I'm going to be supporting the end of the foot. I don't want to take forceps straight through my stitching, and I'm keeping it flat on the table. So I'm going to encourage that to be that nice flat finish that we were talking about. Just using medium-sized pieces and tucking that in, and I'm going to fill up that whole leg. Making sure too to keep that shape that I was talking about, and also looking at it while you're filling, making sure that you're matching it up to the other side, the other leg. That's super important as well. So just take a little more stuffing, keeping on going, tucking that in there. And you also want to be using your wool felting needle as you go, and you can tuck that in away from the edge, filling that out, keeping that lovely eclipse shape, and fill it right up to the edge. Use your wool felting needle, tuck it all in there so it's out of your way, and then we will be ready to come back and close that opening. So that's nicely filled now, and I'm checking that I've got those nicely matched. We've got that all of that filling tucked in, packed in nicely, and we're going to start closing with our ladder stitch. So I have a single strand of extra strong thread with a big pile of knots on the end, and that's where we're going to start. Remember to match your thread to your backing fabric. Don't match it to the fur, match your thread colour to the backing fabric. So now I'm looking at where that seam starts to open out. I'm taking my needle up on the underneath at that seam allowance of 4 millimeters. Taking that needle through, I'm going to pull it all the way through. That knot is going to hold, and then we're going to travel straight across to the opposite side. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to dive in at my 4 millimeter seam allowance. Going to take one stitch, making sure it's nice and small, so this is all going to close down evenly. You've got one stitch going across now. Give it a little squeeze and pull on those threads. Take your needle back in to the first hole, the first entry hole on the opposite side. Travel down the length of just one stitch, same length as the other side. Still at that 4 millimeter seam allowance. Pull that all the way through, get your little fur pieces out, give it a squeeze and a tug on that thread. You want to be doing that with every stitch. Going to cross over again. Each time you're going back into that last exit hole. Travel down again the length of one stitch. Pull those threads nice and tight. Fur out the way. Back across to the other side, and again back in that last exit hole. And each time giving that a squeeze and pulling on those threads so it's nice and tight. I do have a video on Pay It Forward which shows you how to sew this stitch, this closing stitch in a much clearer view on a felt arm from memory. I think so, that's what it is. But it's the same process. It's just a little different with fur because you've got those fur pieces out of, in the way. But just as you go, use your needle to pull the little fur pieces out so they're not getting too trapped and preventing that seam from closing nicely. And certainly you travel all the way down, you would never do your stitching all the way down and then try and pull on those threads and try and pull everything and knit everything in together, because it just wouldn't happen. You need to do it with every couple of stitches. Super important, because this seam needs to be quite invisible. So it's just a matter of keeping on going, swapping over from side to side, all the way down until that opening is closed. When you get to the end, just come down at the base here somewhere, make a knot on the surface, and then sink that knot. And you should have a lovely finished seam like this. Should be nothing to see, and you can brush that fur out. A beautiful finish. So that completes my two beautiful little rear legs there, all ready to go. We can put those aside. They're going to be airbrushed when we airbrush the head and the rest of the body. Now we're going to start on the centre body gusset. So we've got our inner legs which get sewn into the inner leg curves here. And we do that right sides together. You have to make sure that the toes are pointing upwards. And so this is the neck, toes pointing upwards, and we have to put right sides together. So I always work on the gusset when I'm pinning these in. So you're pinning a curve to a curve. When you start pinning this in place, there should be a little point extending at the end. And you're just going to fit those curves in together. And you should have the same situation at the end of the curve where you've got that little bit of a point extending. That just allows for your seam allowance. Get that pinned into place. So that has that inner leg section pinned into place. You need to make sure, as I said, have a good look at that, where we've got toes pointing upwards to the neck edge, right sides together. Now, next we're going to take a single strand of extra strong thread and we're just going to overcast that into place, remove all the pins, and then you will sew that seam at a 4mm seam allowance with the same stab back stitch that we used on the foot pads. And you do need to hand sew it into place. This is one of the most crucial parts of construction in this kind of design. Super important that you get it accurate, so you need to sew it by hand. So once you've got that one stitched into place, you do exactly the same with the other leg. Again, making sure toes are pointing upwards, working on that gusset. So there you can see I've got those two inner leg pieces all stitched in beautifully, and I've gone ahead again and used my wire brush to brush out that fur. Now we are going to start adding the side body pieces. So I have one of my side body pieces. We're going to put right sides together. And we are going to be working on the side body piece, not on the gusset when we're doing this. Now this section here, this is the front of the neck. Normally this section would be up here in an upright position. We'd be adding the head here because this is our little donkey. His head is drooping down. So this section is open. This is where we start our pinning. So we're going to be matching up with that top edge there and that point. So first of all, popping a pin in there, and then we want to line up the seam here. So if you have a look at this seam that I've already done, if I pull it forwards there, it's pulling the little leg piece inwards a little, and I know it's very, very marginal, it's a very, very minimal, sorry, that it pulls in, but it does make the whole front section sit better. So I want you to push that seam downwards, and we're going to line it up exactly with that mark that we've got on the side piece. So line up that seam exactly with that seam pushing downwards. Take a pin straight through. Then you're going to pin these two layers together, and then you're going to continue on all the way down to the toe. So pin all the way down to the toe there, and then you're going to overcast that, and then you're going to sew that seam with that same 4mm seam allowance 2 times for strength on the machine. Then you're going to flip it over and you're going to do the same thing with the other side. And again, you're working on the side panel and keeping that seam pushed downwards so that everything is going to sit, those front legs are going to sit even and nicely turned in slightly. Once you have those centre front leg seams stitched, you can see how nicely that front's up, front of our little donkey. You want to go ahead and roll those seams out really well. We always roll out seams and brush them out while we have really good access to them. Brush those out ready. Now the next step here is we're going to add the fringing or the wool or the, in my case, the wefted mohair to the body for the mane section. We also add some to the head, and we add it now because it starts to get a little bit tricky in here when we're putting the rest of the body together. So now is a good time to do it. So I promised you I would show you the wefted mohair, of course, which has finally arrived. And this is beautiful pure mohair, and you can see that it's bound onto a lovely, very fine bound edge, and you've got this gorgeous long mohair pieces, like I said, used for doll wigs normally. You can use, of course, your wool, your normal yarn. The way that I'm going to be doing this is it's very simple. So this is also really easy to use. I've got my marks on my side body piece. We start a little way from the edge and down to this mark here. And I've got 2 layers of my wefted mohair. This one is 5 inches long. It doesn't have to be that long, but I like the idea of that longer piece sweeping over the back of the shoulders. And then the pieces I have for the head are 3 to 4 inches. So what I will do is simply take my mohair, weft, line it up with the edge there. I've cut it to exactly fit that section and meet up with that mark. I'm going to do a very, very fine zigzag and zigzag that into place on the right side of the fabric. So just remember that, it must be on the right side of the fabric. And then I'm going to do the same on the other side because I want this to be double thickness so that my mane is nice and full. So I'll sew that to the other side. And then that's beautifully in place for when we go to sew that centre back seam. This will all be incorporated within the seam. So when you do sew your pieces on, if you're using yarn, what you'll want to do is take your cut pieces of yarn, whatever length you want, cut lots of pieces, and you can take it to the machine and you can stitch them on within that seam allowance and keep adding your pieces as you go when you're stitching it in. So sewing them down like this. You might be using fringing, which is applied just the same as this, or you might want to make your own fringing with your yarn first by stitching all those lengths together and then adding it to your piece. However you want to do it, it will all come out the same. It's just that traditionally I wanted to stick with that mohair for that beautiful vintage look. So I'm going to get those stitched into place and then we're going to move on to continue to construct. So there you go, that has that main piece stitched in place. You can see a nice tight zigzag all the way down on both sides, so we've got that double thickness. How beautiful does that wefted mohair look over the mohair? It's the perfect combination, and if you have a look at the Christopher Robin movie, this is exactly how this donkey was put together with these types of mohairs and this wefted mohair. But certainly you can use all sorts of yarn, and also if you're working with yarn, have a little play with it first with your wire brush with that yarn. It's possible to brush it out and give you that beautiful fluffy look as well, just with the different types of yarn. So have a little play with that as well. So now we are going to put these two together. Turn that back round. And we're going to just sew up the back of the legs here to the body. Now again, we are working on the side body piece. Super important again for that body to be sitting well and correctly. So we are going to be sewing and pinning from the heel of the foot. Make sure it's beautifully lined up. And if you're following your seam allowances, everything is going to meet up absolutely perfect. This seam here, you need to push it backwards, so towards the back of the body, and pin and lock in that seam with that end of the leg there. Right there, make sure it's exactly in that right spot. Take your pin through, pin that one all the way down. You're going to overcast it and you're going to sew that 2 times with that 4mm seam allowance. Do make sure you really go back and forth here because this is a really crucial stress point in our animal. Once you've done that, flip it over. And then do exactly the same on the opposite side. Remember, keep that seam pushed backwards. Now with those back legs seams stitched, we're going to move on to the centre back seam. Now the centre back seam we pin, overcast and sew, and it's from this top neck edge here all the way down to the base here. Now we've got marks on our pattern, back pattern piece. Of course there were the marks that showed us where to put the main in place. Then we have the marks that give us the opening from where we turn it through and stuff it, and there's a mark here for the tail. So we're going to be stitching down to that first mark of the opening, making sure you go back and forth, and also from the bottom of that mark down to the base there. The same, always back and forth on your start and finish of your stitching. And when you're sewing through this section where the main is, you can give yourself a couple more millimeters in your seam allowance to make sure that you are incorporating all of that. I also will be stitching mine through that section in a black, just so that that stitching isn't showing on that seam when it opens out, and then I'll change to my other colour here. You don't have to do that, but when it does, when the main parts, I'd rather that it was black stitching to that point. So I'm going to pin it, overcast it and get that stitched. There you can see that back seam sewn, leaving that back opening. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew the base in place. This time we're sewing on the bottom gusset. I've taken a pin straight through the centre mark there. I've opened up my overcasting stitching just here on that centre back seam so I can push that seam nice and flat. And I am taking my pin straight through at the 4mm seam allowance and making sure that it's going exactly through the centre. And then I'm just going to pin that one into place, tucking in that fur as I go, making sure that's anchored in nice and straight. And I'll just do one either side. I am pinning this in 3D style, where I go through all the layers with my pin, and then I just take up some on the other side. Just like that. And I'm going to make my way all the way around to under where that little armpit is, where we finished our stitching. You will match up beautifully. You won't need to do any kind of easing if you have kept all of your seam allowances. So I'll get that all pinned into place, and then I will overcast it, and then this project is big enough that you can just pop this under the machine and stitch that whole seam 2 times. Do make sure that you really reinforce here under each of those arms. That completes the sewing part of constructing our body. Now we just have to add the neck circle and the foot pads. Now the neck circle, if you're using fur, I recommend that you have the fur pile going to the back of the head. So the fur pile heading back into the back of the neck. So obviously it won't matter if you're not using fur, but I just think it leaves for a tidier front neckline if you do that. Also, I've cut the neck circle in the same colour as the body fur. You could cut it in the same colour as the centre body gusset. It doesn't make too much difference, but I do find that the pile direction does make a difference. Send it to the back so that the front of the neck is nice and clean. So I've just taken a pin through that neck circle, the seam allowance there, and straight through that centre back seam, which again, I've opened it up just a little bit, and I'm simply going to make my way around, fitting that in just exactly the same way as you do a foot pad. So pinning through all the layers, flipping it over, taking some up on the other side. Again, this pattern piece will fit perfectly if you have kept to your seam allowances. So once I've done that and that's all pinned in, I'm going to treat it exactly the same as a foot pad. So I'm going to overcast all the way around, and then I'm going to sew a stab back stitch, same as we do on a foot pad, with my extra strong thread. And you only need to sew it once because you're sewing a back stitch. And then we will go ahead and we will do the same with the foot pads. So you can do that as well. You can do them both at the same time if you like, where we're going to pin in those. They're the same foot pad as the rear legs that we've already done. Pin those in, top and bottom first, fit that in, same thing, overcast, and then sew again with that 4mm seam allowance with that stab back stitch. Get those all put together and stitched in, and then we can turn that body through. Just before you turn that one through, once you're done putting in the foot pads and the neck circle, go ahead and make the holes for the joints for the rear legs in the neck circle and for the tail here. So there we go, all turned through, and of course take the time to brush out all of your seams, roll out all of your seams. Isn't that exciting to see? It already looks like that gorgeous little donkey, doesn't it? And that mohair for the mane, just gorgeous. So we can actually pop that one aside, and we're going to get started on the tail. So for the tail, the end of the tail tuft, again, I've just used my felted wefted mohair, and because it has that little binding on it, of course, I can just take that and make a tight little roll, which is exactly what I've done all the way around until I've come up with a little tuft suitable that's going to be inserted into the end of the tail piece. So you can see, get an idea of the size of that there that I've done mine. And now if you're going to be using yarn or wool, you can simply cut all of your strands, then tie a knot in the end and then snip it off, so you've got a knot with all of your strands coming off of it. Same thing, because this end is going to be inserted into the end of the tail, so you won't see it. So that one's all ready, but for now what we're going to do is put together our tail pieces. So we have our right sides together. You've got marks on your pattern pieces that show you what area to leave open, and we're going to leave the base open, ready to add that tail when we get to there. And we are going to pin, we're going to overcast and stitch from this top mark of the opening. I'm going to go around all the way down, and then on this side, just from the bottom part of that mark down to the base. You don't have to sew this one twice because we are not stuffing it. We will add a tiny little bit of stuffing at the end, but it'll be very soft. So you can just sew that once, but do make sure that these areas are very, very secure. Get that one stitched up with that same 4mm seam allowance. Once you have that tail all stitched up, I go ahead and I take a double strand of extra strong thread and I sew a running stitch all the way around the lower edge of that tail where we're going to have this little tuft pop out. And I've kept it very small, it's only about 2 to 3mm in from the edge. Keep those stitches nice and small so it will pull in well. And then we need to take the tail, however you've done it, if you've got a knot tied, snipped, and then your yarn pieces, it's all done the same way. You can either tuck this in through this end up inside, or you can take it through that opening. I'm going to try and take it through the opening, and I'm going to use my forceps to help me do that, to bring it down, give it a little twist, to bring that straight down to the end. We're going in the direction of the pile, so this is probably the easiest way to do it. Okay, so I've just got that little knot piece extending there, and then I'm simply going to tie off the end. I've left my needle on because I'm also going to throw some stitches through there as well. Get that as tight as you possibly can. If you've got a knot and yarn threads hanging down, just tie it under the base of the knot. So keep that tension up, knot that off at least 4 or 5 times, and then I'm going to take my needle and just pass through a few times in and out so that it's super secure. So that little tuft of fur there is nice and secure. I've stitched through that end several times. I've also gone ahead, and this time with your joint spot, we take the hole all the way through. Straight, make sure it's going straight through because the joint on this one is on the outside. So now we're just going to turn this one through the right way. Look at that gorgeous tail, and that is just the perfect way to add a tuft to the end of a tail whenever you're making this sort of look. So I don't need to add any filling in this tail. I want it to be quite soft, and because we've got that little ball at the end, nothing necessary there. If you pop yours in and you feel like it needs a little bit of filling at the end, just add a tiny little bit of polyester filling, but certainly don't stuff the tail. So we keep that nice and soft. So next we're going to create the outside joint that goes all the way through this piece, because traditionally he has a tail that is almost tacked on with like a little nail or a button. You can substitute a button for this if you want to, but I think this look is really good. It's also more of a permanent fixture. So what I'm doing is covering the joint. We've got a glued bolt and disc there, and I have sewn a running stitch with a single strand of extra strong thread all the way around my felt disc that matches my project. I'm also going to be airbrushing this, and I've just made my first preliminary knot. We're going to sit this right in the middle, and we're just going to completely cover that disc. You want to make sure it's right in the center and pull that in nice as tight as you can around that disc, and it gives it a lovely soft effect rather than, I think it's nicer than a a plasticky sort of a button. So I'm going to knot that off at least 4 times, snip those thread ends, then we'll pop it through the tail. There we go, nicely covered. And this coloured felt, this is a pure wool felt that I'm using here. I have given you the template for this piece to cover the 25mm disc. This wool felt is the same colour that I'm using for the eyelids, so bringing it all in together with those tones. Make sure that that hole goes all the way through here, and then we're going to just take a little bit of clear craft glue just on the back, just so that that won't spin around when we do it up. Going to take that all the way through, get that fur out the way. And make sure it's nicely centered. And everything's pulled out from the top there. Push that fur all the way down around it. This works too if you're making it in fabric. Just cover it with fabric, it looks really nice. And tighten that up. For now, that'll just hold it nicely. That glue will set. It also means that we can go ahead and sew up that little opening that we left. Any bits of glue there, we'll just brush out with your wire brush. And that's our tail. Just simply close that opening with your ladder stitch and that's all done. Beautiful. We will be adding a beautiful structured bow right around this joint here to finish off with. We will do that at the end. Now that we have all of our body pieces made, this one is put together in a slightly different way because we're using a support in the front legs. This is a very useful technique for you to learn because you can implement it into many of your designs. So we're starting off very basic with this one and just putting it in the front legs, but this is something you can put in back legs as well. But it's the start for you to learn about interior framework and armature in your soft sculpture, which of course lets you take your work to the next level. So, and it lets you make bigger works too. Now, I have my epoxy sculpt. I've mixed together part A and part B, mixed it all together, used gloves, and now separated it into two parts. I've estimated about the amount that it will take to fill just one of the front feet to the ankle. So I've probably overestimated it, and that's okay. I would rather have too much than too little. And we're going to be filling those front feet, and then we're going to be adding that support. Now this is a 3mm wire. It's very, very strong. You can substitute, as I said at the beginning in the intro, with coat hanger wire. If you've got a nice strong coat hanger wire, will do it. But this is the best one. This is actually fencing wire. And I've given you this template. So you need to cut your piece to the length and shape it to exactly the template that I've given you because it fits this project perfectly. Okay, so with that done, we are going to start filling these feet, and I have some talcum powder here ready. I've got a couple of wooden sticks, dowels, to help me push that clay into the feet. You'll find it quite easy to do because it is it's quite a wide leg there. So I'm just going to start with a small piece. I roll it into a ball. A lot of you have seen me do this with my art dolls where I block the feet in. And we need to be working quite quickly because that clay is going to be starting to set. And before we actually insert these, sorry, just after we insert these, we have to add our back legs. We're actually going to joint the back legs and the tail, because while this clay is setting, we have to very temporarily stuff the body so that it can sit up in the right position and we can get that leg position perfect. So let me just get the clay in those feet for now. So with all of that in place, I can now go ahead and attach my rear legs. So just taking that bolt, passing it through where I've made that hole ready. As I said, working quickly because that clay is already curing in the feet there. Take my corresponding disc, washer and nut. And as we always do, just finger tighten at this stage to make sure that you have all of the fabric pulled out between those layers, that you've got a free moving joint. And then you can go ahead and tighten that up. You should tighten it until you can just move it. So it should be a little tighter than you would want it, but you do want to be able to move it. It's not for posability for this one, it is just setting it in its position. So tighten it up, check that you can just move it, then go ahead and add 1 drop of super glue. My camera's giving me trouble there. 1 drop of super glue in there on that bolt there of that nut, stop that coming away. Then add the other leg on the opposite side. So that has both legs on, and then I'm going to go ahead and add the tail. So just taking off that nut. Those pieces. We're going to go in at the back. Find that hole that I've already made and straight through. Again, making sure everything is flat find that final nut. This one doesn't have to be poseable, it's just about doing it up so it's just nice and secure. Check that you've got some movement in it. And then again, add that drop of super glue. Okay, so legs and tail in place, and now we can take our interior support. We slip it in through that back opening. Make our way to those front legs. And we're going to bring those to two ends down. And what we're looking to find is that hole in the wooden disc on each side. Still keeping everything nice and flat. Once you've found that hole in that disc, be hard to do without eyes seeing in there. There it is. And we're just going to slip that in almost to the bottom. Going to do the same on the opposite side, feeling for that hole in the center. There it is. Again, pushing that down almost to the bottom. This is how we've got that handle in there. We're going to push that in and up. Then we're going to push from the top down nice and evenly, almost to the base. You don't want to puncture through the base. And make sure that you've got everything straight and lined up there. Again, making sure while that clay is still soft that those discs don't twist up. You want them to stay nice and flat. And while that clay is curing, we want to temporarily lightly fill around those wires in the legs. So get in there with your forceps and your polyester filling and just gently fill in around those so that you get your donkey sitting in that correct upright position. Very softly fill it, you don't need to do much there, so that it can cure sitting in that right position. Once you've got it all lightly filled, we can then really check the angles of that front section and leave it to sit nice and still where it will cure perfectly. Now when you're filling the body cavity, when you're putting in one of these supports, you have to come in with your filling and come in front of the support. So if you just fill the cavity up, pushing that forward, you can see there what will happen to your front legs. So it'll push them back. We need to put some stuffing in front of it to pad out that chest and have that, the top curve of that armature bar to be sitting back at an angle like this, following that natural angle of the leg. So filling needs to go in and in front of that bar. And you'll know as you're doing it, you'll see when you need to put more in front of it and more behind it. You can see just by the way that it's sitting. But I'm really softly filling it. And it'll hold itself up beautifully. Make sure you fill in around here too, around that front area, and right down to the back so that it's all sitting up as it would, and then you can get all your angles right. Let me get it softly filled. So I've just changed the camera angle there so that you can see that. So softly filled, very soft, but everything's in position. So this is our side view, little tail on the back view, very soft, but everything being held in its right position. So you want to look at your donkey from every angle, and check that you've got that nice angulation forward. At the front, have a look at how wide these little legs are. And while the clay is soft, it's really sweet to turn those toes outwards. It's a real, if you have a look at all of the pictures of little Eeyore, the original Eeyore, you see that he has those little turned out feet, and it's very sweet. So once you've got that all set into the basic position, you want to leave that there, and that is going to cure nice and hard. Again, check that those discs in there are staying nice and flat. Make sure you haven't moved them in the process of stuffing. Then we're going to let that sit there and cure, and we are going to move ahead onto chapter 2, and we are going to start making the head.